Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and I'm going to be reading some excerpts from a wonderful book by Kate Atkinson called Life After Life. On the back it says, to give you an idea of how it's going to go. What if you had the chance to live your life again and again until you got it right? During a snowstorm in England in 1910, a baby is born and dies before she can take her first breath. During a snowstorm in England in 1910, the same baby is born and lives to tell the tale. What if there were second chances and third chances? In fact, an infinite number of chances to live your life. Would you eventually be able to save the world from its own inevitable destiny? And would you even want to? This is such a wonderful book. I'm going to read you some excerpts from the very beginning about the day a baby is born. And each of the chapters, as you will see, is called Snow, which particularly appeals to me in this very snowless winter that we've been having, although I have hopes for March. So here we go. Snow. February 11th, 1910. An icy rush of air, a freezing slipstream on the newly exposed skin. She is without warning outside the inside and familiar, wet, tropical world has suddenly evaporated, exposed to the elements. A prawn peeled, a nut shelled. No breath. All the world come down to this one breath. Little lungs like dragonfly wings failing to inflate in the foreign atmosphere. No wind in the strangled pipe. The buzzing of 1,000 bees in the tiny curled pearl of an ear. Panic. The drowning girl. The falling bird. Dr. Fellows should have been here, Sylvie moaned. Why isn't he here yet? Where is he? Big dewdrop pearls of sweat on her skin, a horse nearing the end of a hard race. The bedroom fire stoked like a ship's furnace, the thick brocade curtains drawn tightly against the enemy, the night, the black bat. Your man'll be stuck in the snow, I expect, ma'am. It's sure dreadful wild out there. The road will be closed. Sylvie and Bridget were alone in their ordeal. Alice, the parlor maid, was visiting her sick mother. And Hugh, of course, was chasing down his sister, his wild goose of a sister, Isabel, à Paris. Sylvie had no wish to involve Mrs. Glover snoring in her attic room like a truffling hog. Sylvie imagined she would conduct proceedings like a parade ground sergeant major. The baby was early. Sylvie was expecting it to be late like the others. The best laid plans and so on. Ow, ma'am, Bridget cried suddenly. She's all blue, so she is. A girl? The cord's wrapped around her neck. Oh, Mary, Mother of God, she's been strangled, the poor wee thing. Not breathing? Let me see her. We must do something. What can we do? Oh, Mrs. Todd, Mum, she's gone, dead before she had a chance to live. I'm awful sorry. She'll be a little cherub in heaven now for sure. Oh, I wish Mr. Todd was here. I'm awful sorry. Shall I wake Mrs. Glover? The little heart, a helpless little heart, beating wildly, stopped suddenly like a bird dropped from the sky. A single shot. Darkness fell. Next chapter, Snow. February 11th, 1910. For God's sake, girl, stop running around like a headless chicken and fetch some hot water and towels. Do you know nothing? Were you raised in a field? Sorry, sir. Bridget dipped an apologetic curtsy as if Dr. Fellows were minor royalty. A girl, Dr. Fellows, may I see her? Yes, Mrs. Todd, a bonny, bouncing baby girl. Sylvie thought that Dr. Fellows might be over-egging the pudding with his alliteration. He was not one for bonhomie at the best of times. The health of his patients, particularly their exits and entrances, seemed designed to annoy him. She would have died from the cord around her neck. I arrived at Fox Corner in the nick of time, literally. Dr. Fellows held up his surgical scissors for Sylvie's admiration. They were small and neat, and their sharp points curved upwards at the end. Snip, snip, he said. Sylvie made a mental note, a small, vague one, given her exhaustion and the circumstances of it, to buy just such a pair of scissors in case of similar emergency. Or a knife, a good sharp knife, to be carried on one's person at all times, like the robber girl in The Snow Queen. "You are lucky I got here in time," Dr. Fellows said. "Before the snow closed the roads, I called for Mrs. Haddock, the midwife, but I believe she's stuck somewhere outside Telfont St. Peter." "Mrs. Haddock?" Sylvie said and frowned. Bridget laughed out loud and then quickly mumbled, Sorry, sir." Sylvie supposed that she and Bridget were both on the edge of hysteria. Hardly surprising. "Bog Irish," Dr. Fellows muttered. "Bridget's only a scullery maid and a child herself. I'm very grateful to her. It all happened so quickly." Sylvie thought how much she wanted to be alone, how she was never alone. "You must stay until morning, I suppose, Doctor," she said reluctantly. "Well, yes, I suppose I must," Dr. Fellows said, equally reluctantly. Sylvie sighed and suggested that he help himself to a glass of brandy in the kitchen, and perhaps some ham and pickles. "Bridget will see to you." She wanted rid of him. He had delivered all 3 of her children, and she did not like him one bit. Only a husband should see what he saw, pawing and poking with his instruments in her most delicate and secretive places. Doctors for women should all be women in themselves. Ha, little chance of that. Dr. Fellows lingered humming and hawing, overseeing the washing and wrapping of the new arrival by a hot-faced Bridget. Bridget was the eldest of 7, so she knew how to swaddle an infant. She was 14 years old, 10 years younger than Sylvie. When Sylvie was 14, she was still in short skirts, in love with her pony, Tiffin. Had no idea where babies came from. Even on her wedding night, she remained baffled. Her mother, Lottie, had hinted, but had fallen shy of anatomical exactitude. Conjugal relations between man and wife seemed mysteriously to involve larks soaring at daybreak. Lottie was a reserved woman. Some might have said narcoleptic. Her husband, Sylvie's father, Llewellyn Beresford, was a famous society artist, but not at all bohemian. No nudity or louche behavior in his household. He had painted Queen Alexandra when she was still a princess. Said she was very pleasant. "How about some hot tea and a nice bit of buttered toast, Mrs. Todd?" Bridget said. "That would be lovely, Bridget." The baby, bandaged like a pharaonic mummy, was finally passed to Sylvie. Softly she stroked the peachy cheek and said, "Hello, little one." And Dr. Fellows turned away so as not to be a witness to such syrupy demonstrations of affection. He would have all children brought up in a new Sparta if it were up to him. "Well, perhaps a little cold collation wouldn't go amiss," he said. "Is there, by any chance, any of Mrs. Glover's excellent piccalilli?" Next chapter. 4 seasons fill out the measure of the year. February 11th, 1910. Sylvie was woken by a dazzling sliver of sunlight, piercing the curtains like a shining silver sword. She lay languidly in lace and cashmere as Mrs. Glover came into the room, proudly bearing a huge breakfast tray. Only an occasion of some importance seemed capable of drawing Mrs. Glover this far out of her lair. A single half-frozen snowdrop drooped in the bud vase on the tray. "Oh, a snowdrop," Sylvie said, "the first flower to raise its poor head above the ground. How brave it is." Mrs. Glover, who did not believe that flowers were capable of courage or indeed any other character trait, laudable or otherwise, was a widow who had only been with them at Fox Corner for a few weeks. Before her advent, there had been a woman called Mary who slouched a great deal and burnt the roasts. Mrs. Glover tended, if anything, to undercook food. In the prosperous household of Sylvie's childhood, cook was called cook. But Mrs. Glover preferred Mrs. Glover. It made her irrepressible. Sylvie still stubbornly thought of her as cook. "Thank you, cook." Mrs. Glover blinked slowly like a lizard. "Mrs. Glover," Sylvie corrected herself. Mrs. Glover set the tray down on the bed and opened the curtains. The light was extraordinary, the black bat vanquished. So bright, Sylvie said, shielding her eyes. So much snow, Mrs. Glover said, shaking her head in what could have been wonder or aversion. It was not always easy to tell with Mrs. Glover. Where is Dr. Fellows? Sylvie asked. There was an emergency, a farmer trampled by a bull. Oh, how dreadful. Some men came out from the village and tried to dig his automobile out, but in the end, my George came and gave him a ride. Ah, Sylvie said, as if suddenly understanding something that had puzzled her. And they call it horsepower, Mrs. Glover snorted, bull-like herself. That's what comes of relying on newfangled machines. Sylvie said, reluctant to argue with such strongly held views. She was surprised that Dr. Fellows had left without examining either her or the baby. He looked in on you. You were asleep, Mrs. Glover said. Sylvie sometimes wondered if Mrs. Glover was a mind reader, a perfectly horrible thought. He ate his breakfast first, Mrs. Glover said, displaying both approval and disapproval in the same breath. The man has an appetite, that's for sure. I could eat a horse, Sylvie laughed. She couldn't, of course. Tiffin popped briefly into her mind. She picked up the silver cutlery, heavy like wettins, ready to tackle Mrs. Glover's deviled kidneys. Lovely, she said. Were they? But Mrs. Glover was already busy inspecting the baby in the cradle. Sylvie idly wondered if Mrs. Haddock was still stuck somewhere outside Chalfont St. Peter. I hear the baby nearly died, Mrs. Glover said. Well, Sylvie said, such a fine line between living and dying. Her own father, the society portraitist, slipped on an Isfahan rug on a first-floor landing after some fine cognac one evening. The next morning, he was discovered dead at the foot of the stairs. No one had heard him fall or cry out. He had just begun a portrait of the Earl of Balfour. Never finished, obviously. Afterwards, it turned out that he had been more profligate with his money than either mother and daughter realized, a secret gambler. They sank into genteel and well-mannered poverty. Sylvie's mother grew pale and uninteresting. Larks soared no more for her as she faded, consumed by consumption. 17-year-old Sylvie was rescued from becoming an artist model by a man she met at the post office counter, Hugh. A rising star in the prosperous world of banking, the epitome of bourgeois respectability. What more could a beautiful but penniless girl hope for? Lottie died with less fuss than expected, and Hugh and Sylvie married quietly on Sylvie's 18th birthday. They spent their honeymoon in France before settling in semi-rural bliss in Deauville, not in Deauville, near Beaconsfield, in a house that was vaguely Lutyens in style. We should give the house a name, Hugh said. The laurels, the pines, the elms. But we have none of those in the garden, Sylvie pointed out. No. The previous owner of their unnamed house had sold up and gone to live in Italy. Imagine, Sylvie said dreamily. She had been to Italy when she was younger, a grand tour with her father, while her mother went to Eastbourne for her lungs. Full of Italians, Hugh said dismissively. Quite. That's rather the attraction, Sylvie said, unwinding herself from his arm. The gables, the homestead. Do stop, Sylvie said. A fox appeared out of the shrubbery and crossed the lawn. Oh, look, Sylvie said. How tame it seems. It must have grown used to the house being unoccupied. Let's hope the local hunt isn't following on its heels, Hugh said. It's a scrawny beast. It's a vixen. She's a nursing mother. You can see her teats. Hugh blinked at such blunt terminology falling from the lips of his recently virginal bride. Look, Sylvie whispered. Two small cubs sprang out onto the grass and tumbled over each other in play. Oh, they're such handsome little creatures. Some might say vermin. Perhaps they see us as verminous, Sylvie said. Fox Corner. That's what we should call the house. No one else has a house by that name, and shouldn't that be the point? Really, Hugh said a little doubtfully. It's a little whimsical, isn't it? Sounds like a children's story. The house at Fox Corner. A little whimsy never hurt anyone. Speaking strictly, though, Hugh said, can a house be a corner? Isn't it at one? So this is marriage, Sylvie thought. 2 small children peered cautiously round the door. Here you are, Sylvie said, smiling. Maurice, Pamela, come and say hello to your new sister. Warily, they approached the cradle and its contents, as if unsure as to what it might contain. Another girl, Maurice said gloomily. He was 5, 2 years older than Pamela, and the man of the family for as long as Hugh was away. On business, Sylvie informed people, although in fact he had crossed the channel post-haste to rescue his foolish younger sister from the clutches of the married man with whom she had eloped to Paris. Maurice poked a finger in the baby's face and she woke up and squawked in alarm. Mrs. Glover pinched Maurice's ear. Sylvie winced, but Maurice accepted the pain stoically. Sylvie thought she really must have a word with Mrs. Glover when they were alone. What are you going to call her? Mrs. Glover asked. Ursula, Sylvie said. I shall call her Ursula. It means little she-bear. Mrs. Glover nodded noncommittally. The middle classes were a law unto themselves. Her own strapping son was a straightforward George, tiller of the soil from the Greek, according to the vicar who had christened him. And George was indeed a ploughman on the nearby Ettringham Hall estate farm, as if the very naming of him had formed his destiny. Not that Mrs. Glover was much given to thinking about destiny, or Greeks, for that matter. Well, must be getting on, Mrs. Glover said. There'll be a nice steak pie for lunch and an Egyptian pudding to follow. Sylvie had no idea what an Egyptian pudding was. She imagined pyramids. We all have to keep up our strength, Mrs. Glover said. Yes, indeed, Sylvie said. I should probably feed Ursula again for just the same reason. She was irritated by her own invisible exclamation mark. For reasons she couldn't quite fathom, Sylvie often felt herself impelled to adopt an overly cheerful tone with Mrs. Glover, as if trying to restore some kind of natural balance of humors in the world. Mrs. Glover couldn't suppress a slight shudder at the sight of Sylvie's pale, blue-veined breast surging forth from her foamy lace peignoir. She hastily shooed the children ahead of her out of the room. Porridge, she announced grimly to them. God surely wanted this baby back, Bridget said when she came in later that morning with a cup of steaming beef tea. We have been tested, Sylvie said, and found not wanting. This time, Bridget said. Snow, February 11th, 1910. Bridget removed the breakfast tray and Sylvie said, Oh, leave the little snowdrop. Here, put it on my bedside table. She kept the baby with her, too. The fire was blazing now, and the bright snow light from the window seemed both cheerful and oddly portentous at the same time. The snow was drifting against the walls of the house, pressing in on them, burying them. They were cocooned. She imagined Hugh tunneling heroically through the snow to reach home. He had been away 3 days now, looking for his sister Isabel. Yesterday, how long ago that seemed now, a telegram had arrived from Paris saying, The quarry has gone to ground. Stop. Am in pursuit. Stop. Although Hugh was not really a hunting man. She was sent her own telegram. What should she say? Something cryptic. Hugh liked puzzles. We were for, stop. You are gone, but we are still for, stop. Or something more prosaic. Baby has arrived, stop. All well, stop. Were they? All well? The baby had nearly died. She had been deprived of air. What if she wasn't quite right? They had triumphed over death this night. Sylvie wondered when death would seek his revenge. Sylvie finally fell asleep and dreamed that she had moved to a new house and was looking for her children, roaming the unfamiliar rooms, shouting their names, but she knew they had disappeared forever and would never be found. She woke with a start and was relieved to see that at least the baby was still by her side in the great white snowfield of the bed. The baby, Ursula. Sylvie had had the name ready. Edward, if it turned out to be a boy. The naming of children was her preserve. Hugh seemed indifferent to what they were called, although Sylvie supposed he had his limits. Scheherazade, perhaps not, or Guinevere. Ursula opened her milky eyes and seemed to fix her gaze on the weary snowdrop. "Rock-a-bye, baby," Sylvie crooned. How calm the house was. How deceptive that could be. One could lose everything in the blink of an eye, the slip of a foot. One must avoid dark thoughts at all cost, she said to Ursula.